They move it up over the line. A long pass by Mikhailov didn't work. Cleared in front of the net on the boards. And Philadelphia, two-man break again. A breakaway. Leafs going ready on goal. Goal! Beautiful goal by the Leafs. Terrific.
Pretty good job of interference run, too, by Gary Dornhofer, but Rick McLeish is an excellent shooter. Not too often, Dennis, you'll see the Soviets get caught like this. Here it comes. What's the interference on the part of the one Flyer right there as he moves over at the line. Here's McLeish. Perfect spot.
FlyersNittyGritty.com presents the O&B Puckcast, episode number 95. We're here to commemorate a special occasion which is upcoming, and we're going to have a very special guest. I'm your host, Isaiah, and I am here with my partner, Chef B.
How you doing?
All right. And, of course, the great Dan Silver.
Hey, good evening, everyone.
All right. So we're here to commemorate the upcoming anniversary, because we think there's going to be a rush of events in January that it might overtake January the 11th of 2021. And we want to make sure that with our special guest that we take a look at the 45th anniversary of the Flyers playing the Central Red Army in one of probably the top five greatest Flyer games of all time. So our guest tonight, NHL.com writer for the Philadelphia Flyers, and he's also at Hockey Buzz, also on the Flyers Daily podcast so often with Jason Martinez, and he's the one and only Bill Meltzer.
Hey guys, how you doing tonight?
All right. So, Bill, this is a real thrill for us to have someone such an estimable historian such as yourself to talk about really such a great game, a great moment, and hopefully we can kind of bring that excitement to the people listening tonight to give them a sense for what this occasion was all about, you know, who the Soviets were, you know, the status of their hockey, and the defending two-time Stanley Cup champion Flyers, where they were at on this great night in 1976. So maybe we can start there.
Sure. Well, I mean, I think you can go back to the Summit Series of 1972, where you had a group of NHL stars, including a young Bobby Clarke at that time, which was, you know, where he really made his name internationally and you know, across Canada. And you had, you know, they played the Red Army team, which they'd won a lot of world championships. They'd emerged as an international powerhouse, but this was the first time they were playing, you know, a team of NHL stars. And the early part of the series, you know, did not go Canada's way at all. They got humiliated actually on you know, on their home rink. It turned out to be a war of a series that Canada ultimately prevailed in. That was the series where Clarkie slashed Valery Harlamov, who was the big star on the Russian team, and was still their star actually when the Soviet team came to Philadelphia in 1976. So, you know, I do want to clear up one myth from that 72 Summit Series before we get to 76, because it's a pet peeve of mine. Clarke did not break Harlamov's ankle. He didn't shatter his ankle. There's video footage of it. You can see it on YouTube. Harlamov had an ankle bruise. That's all it was. A bad bruise, but a bruise. He didn't even fall down after he got slashed. He actually confronted Clarke afterwards. So, you know, they on the ice, stayed on his feet. So, you know, that bit of mythology, you know, is been exaggerated over the years. But it was a key moment because, you know, Harlamov Karlov was limited somewhat after the rest of that. Canada went on to win the series. Paul Henderson scored the famous series-winning goal, and that's the backdrop to that. In '76, there were two Russian teams that toured North America to play NHL teams. There was Red Army and there was Soviet Wings team. Soviet Wings was a very good team in its own right, but not the all-time powerhouse that the Red Army team was. And the Red Army team went undefeated against the NHL teams. And they did tie a game in Montreal, but they beat every other NHL team they played against, going into the final game of the series, which was at the Spectrum in Philadelphia against the, as you said, two-time defending Stanley Cup champion Flyers. So that is the backdrop to that. And the other really intriguing part of it is that, this is when the Iron Curtain was in place in the Soviet Union. So, traveling to there, seeing their hockey was not common, even for the brightest hockey minds. And Fred Shero actually traveled twice to the Soviet Union during the NHL off seasons to study under Tarasov, who was he was the father of Russian hockey, as he was known, Anatoly Tarasov. And so Shero had a better knowledge of the Russian systems than pretty much anybody in North America. That played into the strategy that the Flyers played, when they played against the Red Army team. So, you had the best team internationally in the world, the best team in the NHL at that time, and they were meeting up in Philadelphia. And for probably the first and only time, NHL Commissioner Clarence Campbell, who detested the Flyers and their Broad Street bully reputation and all that, although the league certainly didn't mind the revenues when the Flyers were in town because they were a guaranteed sellout in any building they played in. But he told the Flyers that they had the honor of the NHL at stake, and I don't know how much I motivated those guys, but they were certainly motivated to show that they were the best, they were the better hockey team, and that was the backdrop. They head into a game that got worldwide attention, as much if not more than the two games that won the Stanley Cup for the Flyers.
Yeah, and Bill, even the Wings had a pretty good record. The only game that B team lost was a 12-6 shootout to the Sabres that year. That was a wild game. I saw some of the highlights on that. So the Montreal Canadiens, like you were saying, is a great game. If you ever saw parts of that game, beautifully played game, they still couldn't beat the Red Army. And that was, like you said, it just really kind of put it all on the Flyers, and Flyers had something in store for them, didn't they?
Oh, they did. And before they took the ice, Shero said to his players, Fred Shero said, we'll show them a real Iron Curtain. And because Shero had studied Soviet tactics firsthand, and actually kind of struck up an unlikely but a good friendship with Tarasov, there are funny stories from his trip to Russia, because Shero, although his parents were from Russia, he spoke no Russian and Tarasov spoke no English. So they met up and they just diagrammed hockey plays. They spoke through the language of hockey. Well, the language of hockey and a couple bottles of vodka. But they sat in Tarasov's apartment and they talked hockey for 2 nights. And Shero brought back drills and tactics and various things he learned from the Soviet systems. So he knew that the Russian players, and they had the reputation that they did not like to shoot the puck very much. They almost passed it into the net. And they said, as long as you take away in the middle of the ice, don't chase them. Let them stick hand on the perimeter all night long. Don't chase them, because that'll create lanes. Just take away the lanes. And at some point they have to come to you. And that's what he did. That's why the Flyers outshot them. I think it was something like 41-14 or thereabouts for the game. So Shero had the perfect game plan to play against them. And of course the Flyers also brought their physical side to the game too, and I'm sure we'll get into that very shortly.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that Dennis Potvin said, rewatching the broadcast, is when the Islanders had lost to the Wings, I think it was like a 2-1, really tight defensive game. He said they had never seen a team that could skate like them and possess the puck consistently like that. And that was something that Fred Shiro, like you're saying, understood strategically how not to play into that, because the Islanders obviously got caught into that themselves a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, the Flyers, for all the things the Flyers had going for them, and they had some speedsters on the team, guys like Rick McLeish could really skate, but I mean, nobody could skate with the Red Army, so don't play their game and let them circle and pass and weave, to their heart's content. As long as you keep them away from the slots and keep them along the perimeter, then you'd be fine. And the Flyers had numbers pretty much all night long. If you go and watch that, there were always two Flyers to one Red Army player, and no lanes to pass through. They swarmed them pretty well in that game. So, that tactic worked to perfection. And one thing that Loktev, the Russian coach, although he was a good coach for his era, one thing he was not very good at was adjustments, which was always kind of one of the knocks against the Soviet teams. They had good game plans, but if it wasn't working, they didn't adjust very well. And they never adapted at all to what the Flyers were doing. If you watch the third period, even when they're down by 3 goals, they're still in the perimeter, circling, weaving, passing backwards, with no answers to how to combat what the Flyers were doing. Shiro was a great tactician among many other assets as a head coach. So that the coaching side of that certainly went to the Flyers' favor.
Yeah, no doubt about it. I think the Flyers are a little bit overrated as an offensive team when you think about Montreal and then later teams like the Islanders and the Oilers. But, you roll out lines like the LCB line with Clark, Barber, and Leach is having in the middle of his best, his career year. Then you have McLeish, Dornhofer, and Lonsbury healthy, and Kindrachuk probably had one of his best years with the Schultz and Selesky playing much better than maybe the reputation would assume. And then, of course, you have a Mel Bridgman who went on to give a greater contribution after McLeish got hurt midway through the year.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the Flyers actually, that regular season, I was just breaking down some numbers for actually a separate article I'm doing for the Flyers website pertaining to the year that Wayne Stevenson, who was the goalie for that game and the goalie most of that year because Bernie Brown was injured. The Flyers, first of all, were unbeatable on home ice that year. They had, I believe, 2 regulation. Well, they didn't have overtime losses. They had like 2 losses and 2 ties that year, and the rest were wins at home ice. And the Flyers were the highest scoring team in the NHL that year. I think top 4 or so in goals against average, but that particular season, because that was a year that Barber scored 50, Clark won the Hart Trophy again. Leach, as you said, had his 61 goal season that year. That was his career best. McLeish was a great hockey player. Lonsbury, Dornhofer, they made a formidable second line, and just up and down that lineup, the Flyers were stacked. And really they were solid on the blue line too. Not the fastest defense score, but solid defensively. And so that was a really good hockey team. When people say the Flyers bullied their way to 2 cups, well, they had a lot of talent on those teams too. They, obviously Perron wasn't available for this, but I mean, the Flyers had the goaltending, they had the coaching. You had 2 Hall of Fame forwards, 2 guys who were all-star caliber forwards, and Leach and Leach and McLeish. So there was a lot of talent on that team too as well. But yeah, I mean, you can't really stack up a team. Montreal was just loaded with Hall of Fame players at every position. LaFleur and Schutt and Cormier was a great player, and just go right down the line. Larry Robinson on defense.
Oh, man, he was something.
Yeah. It was a murderer. So, the Flyers had to win. The Flyers were more talented than most teams in the league, but not the Montreal. I mean, they won 4 cups in a row for a reason. But the Flyers did have a lot of talent on those teams. So, they were an opportunistic team too. They were a smart team. They didn't throw a lot of pucks away, and they needed it for that year particularly. They had really good special teams. They were an outstanding penalty killing team, which you needed, being as shorthanded as often as they were, and that let them play that physical brand of hockey that they brought. Because if you were constantly worried about paying for it on the PK, I don't think it would have worked nearly as well.
Yeah. Definitely. Just it was a fun time to be a fan and even to admire what the Canadians were able to do. But So it's game day. They'd already had a banquet. Was that earlier in the day or the day before? I kind of forget that.
No, that was the day before, because this was an afternoon. This was an afternoon game.
Right,
So they did it one day before. And the story about that is that Gene Hart, who spoke a good deal of Russian, taught Ed Snyder how to say a phrase in Russian, wishing both teams luck in the game. And then Ed Snyder didn't say it. And, and afterwards Hart said to him, well, why didn't you say it? He said, when I looked at those faces on the other side, I just couldn't do it. And these teams did not like one another. I mean, the banquet was supposed to be a goodwill get together, and they spent the whole time staring each other down. So both sides meant business going into this.
Yeah. So we go to the first period, and if you turn on this game, you would swear it's like Game 7 of the Stanley Cup Final. The building was that loud. Every shot on goal. I mean, the intensity was as high as you would expect for any game in Flyers history. And the Flyers came out playing their game, and the crowd was into it. And then Moose DuPont starts really revving up the physical play. And I'll let you take it from there when Ed Van Imp leaves the box. We'll go from there.
Yeah, so Ed Van Imp was in the penalty box. There were a series of hits. The first one was by DuPont. The second one was by Bill Barber in the offensive corner, which was a totally clean hit. I mean, just lined the guy, finished his check, rattled the boards, and then DuPont, rather than Van Imp, steps out of the box. Our old friend Valery Harlamov is coming down the ice, and Van Imp lines him up, and it might have been an elbow in there. if you watch the replay, it looked like Van Imp's elbow definitely was up on the play. I think that one was another penalty, but but it was not called a penalty. At that point, the Russian coach mumbled to the referees, insisting on a penalty, and he pulled his team off the ice. They left.
And what's that famous call from Bob Cole, who's doing the game? They're going home.
They're going home. The Russians are going home. Yes. And then all sorts of drama ensued, in the bowels of the spectrum to get the Russians back out on the ice. The Russians, first of all, they wanted a penalty on DuPont, I keep saying DuPont. They wanted a penalty on Van Imp as a condition of returning to the ice. They wanted a delay of penalty on themselves canceled out. And basically, they were told by Alan Eagleson, the controversial Alan Eagleson, but he was instrumental in putting the series together. And they were told by Ed Snyder that if you don't send your players back out on the ice, you're not getting paid for this tour, not 1 cent. And they kind of talked amongst themselves, and they decided to go back out. Now, what's interesting is that of all the people that were panicking as to whether the Red Army was going to go back on the ice, one of them was not Fred Shero. Shero said to his players in the locker room, relax, I've seen them pull this stunt before in international games when they haven't liked a ref's call. They'll pull the team off and try to intimidate the refs. They're coming back. And they did. And the Flyers got a power play, and lo and behold, right off the bat, they scored.
Yeah. Reggie Leach tips home a Bill Barber shot. It wasn't really, it just goes to show an accurate shot. And Reggie Leach lost his man in the corner and just tipped home a shot, and the place just exploded. Yeah,
that was that was a pretty, because you said it wasn't the hardest shot, but it was well placed. I mean, the Flyers easily could have completely blown the doors off the Red Army team. Tretiak really played a great game that day. He had a lot of tough saves that game. Even though he gave up 4, it could have been 8 easily. There was probably only 1 that he would have wanted to have back. But now there's bedlam in the Spectrum. I mean, absolutely, the crowd is bonkers after Leach's power play goal, and and then the rest of the afternoon really belonged to the Flyers.
Yeah, and there's some highlight goals, and the classic McLeish goal is next for goal number 2 for the Flyers. He gets a little bit of assist from Gary Dornhofer running more than a little bit of interference that kind of opened up our show tonight. And check that one out on YouTube if you can. But it's that classic McLeish wrist shot. He's got the goalies right in front, and he beats him high to the glove side, kind of like he beat Dryden in '73, the semifinal. Same kind of shot that he was known for. It was a beautiful goal from a great all-time Flyer scorer.
Yeah, one of the all-time great wrist shooters. Same class as a guy like Joe Sakic when it came to, just the. I mean, the way his wrist would snap, and how quickly he got rid of it, and I mean, there's some guys who couldn't slap the puck as hard as he could wrist it, and he got in a hurry, and he was so deadly accurate on it. That was just a, whether it was high or low, because back then, of course, a lot of goals were scored low and quite often from a little bit more distance too. It was before the era of the butterfly, so McLeish could score low, but he could also score high too, and that. He was a deadly shooter. Probably along with Leach, the best pure shooter on the team and one of the all-time best for his era in that particular skill set. So, yeah, McLeish's goal was a beauty, and now it's 2-0.
Yeah, absolutely. So that ends up the period, and the Flyers are feeling really good about themselves. Now, the Soviets did have their best moments in the game in the second period, but that was only after a shorthanded goal that Joe Watson said probably sent Russian hockey back 20 years.
Yeah. Yeah, Joe will it doesn't take much to convince Joe to retell that story. Yeah, I mean, Joe actually just followed the play all the way up the ice. Lo and behold, he's there, puck there in front. He sweeps it down low, and it's in the net. It was weird because, particularly killing a penalty, it wasn't like Joe Watson to go that far up the ice. He just did there, and it all worked, But it just goes to show you. And yes, Freddie Shero told him, you just set Soviet hockey back 20 years with that goal, because of all the guys on the ice you were figuring might score for the Flyers, Joe Watson was probably just about at the bottom of that list. But that was just funny how that worked out.
Yeah, it's right there with Ed Van Impe. But yeah, so after that, I gotta confess that I forget who actually scored the goal to make it 3-1 for the Soviets. I do forget that, but I will give them credit. This is the one period of the game where you felt that the Soviets, if they scored that second goal, you could really have a different kind of game.
Yeah, for sure. And then one of the interesting things was too that originally going into the game, and I just found out about this the other day. Jason Martinez and I interviewed Bobby Taylor for we're doing a goalie week series that Chiefs interviews coming up on, I think, on Wednesday. We'll run then, and he said that going into that game, Shero told him the plan was for Stevenson to go halfway and for Taylor to go the other half of the game. But Stevenson was playing so well and was working on a shutout up to about midway through the game. And Shero said, after it's 3-1, do you mind if we keep Wayne in? And he said, of course not. He's playing great. So, I mean, Stevenson came up, he was hardly tested, as we've said, but if they would have gotten the game back to 3-2, then all of a sudden you're looking potentially at a whole different outcome potentially. Just, that happens so often in hockey too, that those little moments, those segments of 5 minutes here or there that can totally turn a game around. It took the Flyers a couple minutes in there and then to restore some order, because as you said, that was the Red Army's best period, was the second period, and the Flyers had to restore a semblance of order to it, and they did just that.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the third period, the Flyers really put the pedal to the metal, pretty much dominated the entire time. And Larry Goodenough, who was nicknamed Izzy, and he ended up being a very valuable piece in a trade, I believe, for Bob Daly later on. I believe he was one of the guys that went to Vancouver, but I might be wrong. But anyway, in this particular game, he gets one that Tretiak would probably like to have back for the fourth goal. And the Flyers never looked back.
Yeah, and Izzy was a good player. He was an offensive-minded defenseman. As you said, he ended up going to Vancouver as part of the Bob Daly trade. That was one of the really good trades that Keith Allen made. He made a lot of good trades, and that was a really good one. But over the course of Goodenough's career with the Flyers, he was part of the second Cup team as a rookie. Still a solid contributor his second year in the league, and that really was one that Tretiak would have liked back. It was basically the only soft goal he allowed all game, but that really put a clamp on the game. And in some fairness to the Red Army team, they were playing. It was a quick turnaround, so the Flyers were a little more rested than they were. So it's something where, I don't know. I think they started to lose their legs at that point a little bit. They got a little tired. They weren't used to getting hit. They got hit a lot of times that night. So, but it all worked out. The third period, you can get a sense sometimes. I mean, even it's not too frequently a team will erase a 3-goal deficit, but there was never a doubt. The game was totally in hand by that point. And we talked before also that Loktev was not a very good coach in terms of adjustments. They made none. They were still weaving and playing along the perimeter until time ran out. So the Flyers had them where they wanted them.
Yeah. It was a glorious time. If you were nervous about the game and they're just coasting 4-1, you're just taking it in. It's just savoring every moment of a great performance in the game. And of course, it ends up 4-1. The Flyers outshot them 49-13 or something. It's interesting, Bill, during the game, Dennis Potvin mentioned that the Soviets were not only keeping track of shots, but also kind of before Corsi, they were also measuring shots attempted, something that Al Arbour was doing too with the Islanders. So, a further testament to how advanced they were and the melding of the styles of North American and Soviet hockey is kind of where we're at today.
No, for sure. What the Soviets if you've ever read Tarasov wrote a really, really good book shortly before he died, which was translated into English, as to what the Soviets had to teach the Canadians, what the Canadians had to teach the Russian players. And it is a melding of European and North American styles. If it wasn't for your really heavy shooting Canadian players, because the Russians didn't work that much on shooting the puck in that era, as we said at the top of it. You look at a guy like Alex Ovechkin. I mean, one of the best shooters of all time. The Russians really didn't have that in that era, but they had the skating, they had the passing. They had the interchangeable 5-man units. They were the first really to do that. Now you see that in a lot of leagues, a lot of systems. So that now there's less differentiation. You have so many players that go over and play in Europe, and of course so many European players that come over and play here. So it's you see elements of Russian hockey, you see Swedish hockey in the North American game, and all the rest of that. So it's been I think it's been a very good thing for the game. The influence that the different styles of the game have had on each other, and how they've blended over the years. And you still have the difference in the ranks, but really good players are good players. I don't know if in the early years when Russian players started coming over, and we're going a decade ahead at that point, 13 years to be precise. There were guys who had trouble adapting to the NHL game, the NHL rink, and the off ice stuff. That's less so today. There's still remnants of it for some Russian players and whatnot, but I mean it's very much an international and global game now. And things such as that series in '76, the 79 series was played in Leuven NHL All-Star game. Rendezvous 87, some of those outstanding Canada Cup series, 87 being the probably the best of that batch.
Oh yeah.
Team USA winning in 1996. I mean, that was big for American hockey, probably the second biggest victory for American hockey after Lake Placid in '80. But I mean, I think that the growth of the international game has been one of the biggest and best things that happened to the sport over the last 50 years, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Chef, you got a question?
Well, see, you just mentioned it, Miracle on Ice. The documentary of Miracles and Men, I think it's called. I think it was ESPN, 30 or 30 or something. It really details like a lot of the past that took, and I think it overlaps some of the characters. I mean, I'm saying characters, but players and coaches of that time when it went back almost 30 years. I mean, did you find any of that interesting, or as it took you when you were, writing the story about it?
Oh yeah, I mean that it's so interesting to look back, right? And yeah, I mean, the only American on the Flyers at that time, of course, the Flyers were the last team to have an all-Canadian, roster win the Stanley Cup, because that was 1 year, or I guess half a season before this game. Paul Holmgren was the only American Flyer at that time, and it was in '80, the same year as the Miracle on Ice, that Homer became the first American to score a hat trick in the Stanley Cup Finals, and it was notable if it was an American player, So when the Miracle on Ice players first broke into the NHL, the ones who did play, it was a huge deal, for they were curiosity pieces in some cases, or temporary box office attractions, which is really what Jim Craig was in his short time with Atlanta. Because as great as Jim Craig was in that one tournament, Jim Craig was a little less than an NHL goalie, as it turned out. I mean, he did play for Boston. He was in the league a little bit, but but he just caught lightning in a bottle at the right time along with that team. So you look back at, and we could all, if you look back at that era, right, that was you had a very young Pelle Lindbergh on the Swedish team, right? He was the goalie for the Swedish team, the only one the Americans didn't beat. They had a tie game in the first game of the tournament. Jari Kurri was a young player in Finland. Of course, USA beat Finland in the gold medal final game. So I mean, you look back, even 76, you had youngsters coming up through the ranks like Fetisov, guys who were going to go on and become iconic players, and except for maybe a guy like Harlamov, most people in North America didn't even know who the Russian players were. Maybe they knew Mikhailov, but that's something else too, that you know who the stars are, and back then it was just Red Army. I mean, that alone, it was the uniform that had the mystique, even though they had some, a lot of world-class hockey players on the team. Tretiak, of course, in goal. But, it's funny. That's one of those things that you look back at, you could almost put a dividing line, Miracle on Ice and post-Miracle on Ice, for how the game and the international component changed. Having Borje Salming starring for the Maple Leafs was a big thing. Just as really one of the first European stars, bona fide stars in the NHL. Now nobody bats an eye as to where somebody comes from,
Yeah, that really was a big deal. And, it had the usual catcalls about him as a terrific player and, a trendsetter. And then, of course, you had the Stastny brothers.
Well, almost Flyers, yes.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Really. So, just Bill, to wrap up on this particular game, the thing that strikes me as someone who was a 16-year-old at that time, this might be the Flyers' apex. This is the Flyers at their absolute best. I remember the end of the broadcast that Dennis Potvin saying the Flyers are on top of the hockey world right now. Of course, we know what happened after that, but it was really a tremendous time to be a Flyers fan, no doubt.
For sure. A team, big part of winning a cup is when you peak, right? And had the Stanley Cup playoffs been the middle of that season, I think the Flyers would have won a third straight cup, even with Wayne Stevenson in goal rather than Perrant. They didn't have McLeish,
right.
In the Stanley Cup Finals. That hurt, and they were 3-1 goal games, and then the fourth game was a 2-goal margin. That game was tied 14 minutes into the third period. So that was a much closer series than it looked like. But I mean, Montreal was the better hockey team, truthfully, and that's when the Habs went on to win 4 in a row. But you take the Flyers back-to-back cups, tearing through the NHL that first half of season, and beating the Red Army team was kind of the crowning achievement of all of that. I think that probably was the apex. Even though the Flyers had the second longest unbeaten streak in franchise history was in that 75-76 season that lasted almost into the stretch drive. But still, I mean, I think that you can say that things from that spring onwards, year by year was chipped away a little bit, but it never got better than that, and that was an incredible time.
Yeah, it really was. Dan?
Yeah, I mean, first I just want to say it's a real thrill for me to have Bill on the show. I'm sure that most of our listeners, being Flyers fanatics, know who Bill is, but if they don't, I mean, he's the preeminent writer / historian for the Flyers, and I mean, it's great to have him on. And to me, the thing that Bill, that you do so well is that despite the fact that you work presumably for the Flyers on the website doing stuff, you're so good at kind of being able to stay impartial, and you find that a lot of times when people go and work for a team that sometimes what they're saying looks like it might be colored by what the team wants them to say, and you've just done such a great job of staying above that, and probably a lot of it has to do with the organization and the what they say to you, but it's always I love reading your stuff, and thanks for joining us. I mean, it's always great conversing with you, and great to have you on. For me, I was, Isaiah joked I was -3 when this game happened, and it's always, for me, it's a shame the Flyers haven't won a cup during my lifetime. I think back, and I always think to myself, hey, you know what? There's 2 games that I wish I'd been alive to go to, and I'd give anything to go to, because I used to have, me and my dad had season tickets for the Flyers back when they were in the old Spectrum, when I was growing up, maybe in I'd say like the early 90s. And, we were up on that third level, that small third level up in the Spectrum, and it was so loud. I remember playoff games against the Devils where Flyers fans would wait in the concourse underneath the third level to beat up Devils fans. Everyone was just drunk. It was just a total show. But I always think back, I'm like, man, I wish more than anything I could have been at one of those 2 games, the Flyers, the first Stanley Cup win against the Bruins in 1974, and the Russian Red Army game in 76. I'm going to put you on the spot. If you could, because this will I'm just sort of interested in your answer in this. If you could be at one of those 2 games, either the first Stanley Cup win or the Russian Red Army game, what game do you think, I don't know, what game was it louder? What was kind of like a more meaningful victory? How would you compare those 2 games?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would pick Game 6 against Boston, even though it was probably a better played game against Red Army. It was not, if the Flyers weren't involved in Game 6 and 74, and you're just watching, historically a cup clinching win by a team, and strip the history away from it. It wasn't a riveting game for large parts of that game. But that listen, of course the Flyers won the cup back-to-back years, but it's the only time they ever won it at home. I was fortunate enough when the Phantoms won the Calder Cup to be covering it, right? But as a fan, I mean, it's funny when the Blackhawks won the cup in Game 6 in Philly in 2010. And at the time I was doing work for Versus.com before NBC Sports took it over. And so, I had to write about the game, and, you have to write it down the middle. And it was weird. I was experiencing a whole slew of emotions at one time. I would have loved to have seen the Flyers win that game and at least get it back to Chicago. I thought about being a kid and watching on my aunt's little black and white television set, Game 6 against Boston. I was a little kid, but I do remember it. I do remember us driving back to the house in my parents' car, and people were banging on the roof of the car. It was bedlam. It was bedlam driving home from that. And I would have loved to have actually been, old enough to be in the building and appreciating all of that. The cup parades too. So, when you think about 2010, I thought back to the 74 Cup on home ice. You're overcome by just it's incredible being on the ice when there's a cup celebration going on. If you can separate yourself from the emotion of it all, right? Yeah, and you know from being around the game as to how many people work in the game for decades and they never win a cup. And all the people that have a little piece of it too, the scouts and the assistant GMs and the assistant coaches and the guys who were, the guys who might not have even gotten into a game in the postseason, but they were black aces in the roster, and they're on the ice for the celebration. You can appreciate that as someone around the game who loves it. And then the third part of it was as a person who, loved the Flyers since I could walk and talk, broke my heart. So all three emotions are competing against each other at one time, and just to experience the jubilation of winning the cup on home ice, because as great as the win against the Red Army team was, and as important as that was, and historical as it was still a mid-January exhibition game. When you strip everything else away, I mean, it meant a lot more than that to the players and to everything else. But the Stanley Cup Final is the Stanley Cup Final, so I would pick that game.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned the Phantoms championship, because I think back through the games that I was at kind of growing up and through the years. And of course, like my Flyers memories that stick out the most to me were Game 7 against the Devils when, Scott Stevens killed Eric Lindros and the arena went from completely bonkers to you could hear a pin drop in a matter of seconds. And then the Patrick Kane game. Like, those two games are like the games that define my experience growing up with the Flyers, the two home games. Obviously, there's a lot of really good games. I mean, them beating the Rangers and the conference finals, and even some of the games in that Devils series that they ended up losing were just such great games. But to me, and I'd forgotten about it, but that Phantoms game in, I guess it was 1998, and it was sold out. I had to, one of my buddies worked for the Phantoms. He gave me a press pass, and then they weren't going to let me in, and I had to kind of sneak my way in, and I ended up sitting in a stairwell, and there were a lot of fans sitting in the stairwells. It felt like, because the city hadn't won a championship in so long in any sport, because it was the year that it was 10 years before the Phillies won, but it was like no team in Philly had won for so long. And that game, sitting there, you almost felt like people were treating it like a NHL championship game, because the city had been so starved, and that team was so good with Mike Manilock and Jim Montgomery, and Neil Little was so good in net, that it was that game, that Phantoms championship game in '98 was a lot of fun. I think they won that game 6-1, and they just destroyed St. John, or their opponent, and that game was a lot of fun.
It was that was unbelievable, and I thought even better was the 2005 Calder Cup win over Chicago, because remember that was the year of the NHL lockout, so there was no season that year. The NHL season was canceled. That was as close as there was to a Stanley Cup final, and Jeff Carter and Mike Richards and R.J. Umberger and Yoni Pitkinen and Patrick Sharp. Niedermaki was the playoff MVP. A lot of guys who would be in the NHL the next year, were part of that Phantoms team. And again, without any NHL, with really endless bad news, the season was canceled, and just as the season that wasn't, it was very cathartic to actually experience a championship win on home ice. So it's 98 was terrific because it had been so long, and they were a very easy team to root for, and just it was fantastic, and you're happy for Bill Barber to be lifted on his players' shoulders and all. So that it's nothing compares to winning a championship. It's kind of hard to compare one to the other. But but I look back to that 2005 one like wow, that was pretty cool. Let's do that again.
Yeah, that was great.
Good,
yeah. You had all those Flyers kind of like getting some experience, and they were anticipating, from that 03 draft and that they were going to be contributors. So that was definitely a lot of fun in what was otherwise an empty year for hockey.
Yeah, and that it's funny because also you could really see the guys who were going to go on and as you said, be contributors in the NHL from that 2003 draft. Talking about wrist shooters, Jeff Carter's wrist shot is one of the things I remember from that playoff year, and scouts in the stands, like I can fire the puck, and you could see, you could see that, for example, like I think it was Umberger who led the team in scoring during the regular season. I could be wrong about that, but I think Umberger led the team in scoring in the regular season, but in the playoffs it was really the guys like Sharp and Richards and Carter that took over, and of course, they all went on to very notable NHL careers. Not that long after that. And it's I guess the only silver lining to the lockout year was that those guys got a chance to get a lot of ice time at the AHL level and be part of that playoff run. So that that's. I mean, I love tracking player development in general. As much as I like talking about historical stuff, I like tracking prospects and seeing how they develop. I always have an affinity for homegrown players for that reason, because you see them at every step in the process. You see them in development camps. You see them working with the coaches. You see what they had to improve in their games from the get-go. So my favorite players are almost inevitably the guys who came up through the system. Not that I haven't had affinity for players that have come via trade or free agency, but my favorite ones inevitably the ones you saw as young players and watch them through that process to where they blossom the NHL level. That's why 2005 also was such a special memory for me.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the Flyers have their share of players right now that look like they're going to get some WJC action, especially particularly for the United States. Maybe a couple of invitees for Canada. We'll have to see about that. But Bobby Brink and Cam York look like if this thing can go through without a hitch, the World Junior Championship, that we should be able to watch them coming up in a couple weeks.
Yeah, certainly both those guys are shoe-ins. York's the only returning defenseman. He didn't really get to play it all last year, but he was in the roster. He got his couple of shifts. He had some injury issues too at the time he was battling through, but that was disappointing that York didn't get to play much at all. This year will be quite different. He'll play a vital role in the USA blue line, and same thing with Brink too, as a returning player. You'll see him in the power play again. He got some power play time the last time. He's going to be a crucial part of the USA attack. So that's for those two alone will be worth following. There may be as many as maybe as few as 3 Flyers representatives this year. Emil Andre will almost certainly make it for Sweden this year and then come back again next year. And as for Forster and Millman, I don't know. As you said, maybe you never know with COVID as to how rosters are going to really end up looking by the end of it. But those two and Forster will be back next year. Millman is 19, so yeah. This would be his last shot at it. But I mean, even if Forster doesn't go this year, he's got a real good shot a year from now. So that's it's really a lot of times a 19-year-old's tournament anyway. So, but just to follow what Team USA is doing and particularly in a year where there hasn't been a lot of junior hockey, or collegiate hockey either for that matter, it'll be nice to have one of the highlight events of the tournament. I'm really looking forward to, Christmas and beyond, especially as we get into, hopefully, some NHL training camps.
Yeah, absolutely. Chef?
All right, since you brought it up, you've said both of you did, return to play. So realistically, I guess we're looking at like a late January start now, because they probably would have had to announce sometime last week if they were going to start in the first week of January. So I guess my question would be really, because they're getting a late start. I think it's smart with the families. You know, you get your one last shot with families. You still have enough time to do your quarantining afterwards. The NHL showed that they had a good procedures in place last time, so I kind of trust them this time. Is it going to be another bubble situation? And then also, I mean, I guess it would be almost four bubbles then. But since it's starting a little bit later, and I know the problems that they're coming up with, the money being in escrow and all the deals, and that they're going to have to work through the money situation. Is this since we've seen it before over the summer that they can play into the summertime? Do we think that we're going to get at least 60 games out of this, or is this going to be a short season to kind of get ready to come back the following season?
Yeah, I think it'll be a short season, 50-something games maybe. But 60 would be kind of pushing it. They really want to have as normal, quote unquote normal of an off season as possible. I saw where Gary Bettman said they're optimistic of having a normal hockey season in 21-22. Mm-hmm. So this year will be a shorter year. Whether it'll be bubbles or teams in their home arenas with empty stands or whatever, they haven't decided that yet. And there's some players that don't want to go back to a bubble situation. Even like the mini bubbles, I don't know. I think that the hope is, but the problem is also the arena availabilities in all 31 markets. Every team has to be able to get into their rink if you're not doing regional bubbles. So that's one of the issues that has to be figured out. They're going on a leap of faith that by playoff time, you can cross the border again. Because what happens if you go a little deeper into the postseason, and you get matchups with Canadian teams and U.S. teams? That's really one of the biggest reasons for doing the divisional realignment this year. Mm-hmm. If by the springtime, you can cross the border again, then it becomes a non-issue, and that's not something they're going to know right now. So working on all of those logistics, even though they have a 2-week camp, teams are going to need, an exhibition game or two. Mm-hmm. They've talked about doing some kind of a voluntary camp for the teams that haven't played a single hockey game since last March. I don't know if 1 or 2 exhibition games is going to do it, but it might have to do. So yeah, the target date has moved from what I've heard to about January 15th. I think realistically you might have to push it about another week or two after that. And of course, as you said, there's the financial piece of it. Now, I said this to Jason Martinez, and I'll say it here too. I don't think deferred compensation is a hill that the PA is going to die on and kill a season. Mm-hmm. You're not talking about salary rollbacks. You are talking about deferrals. Now, I'm not making light of that, because the player side of it is, well, we agreed to something a few months ago, and we want you to hold up your end of the bargain. But I think when all is said and done, they will settle. They will compromise on deferred compensation for the season. That's a big piece of it too. You may see some escrow adjustment as well, because a drop a full season wouldn't be good for anybody.
Yeah.
Particularly after the last season ended in March. It's there's at least there'll be some TV revenue coming in. At least you get a normal off season. If you haven't played a game in almost a year and a half, right? I mean that would be just a disastrous scenario for a lot of organizations, a lot of hockey players too. You can't go that long without playing at all. So I think that they'll come to some kind of compromise. This week is crucial for that if they want to have a season that starts in January. But I think you'll see in the latter part of January, 50-something games. Gary Bettman does not want to do an expanded playoffs, but he might compromise on that, and you might see another expanded postseason like you saw this past year, and then a normal off season, hopefully, and a normal season next year. But it'll definitely be a shortened season.
Now, a follow-up to that is, what would you think? I mean, we hear the possibility of the vaccine coming out sometime before Christmas, hopefully. And if that's successful, do you think there's any chance of this season of like maybe like a hybrid start of the season where you have no in-house games with fans, and then sometime later on, maybe later in the season, that they would be open to getting that started to add some revenue back into the pot, so to speak.
Well, it all depends on how the rollout goes, right? Because it's going to be limited availability at first. The most vulnerable populations and frontline workers will get the first doses, then it'll expand from there and onward. They're talking about widespread public availability in a best case scenario, sometimes mid to late spring, hopefully. So, maybe by a playoff, by playoff time. But I mean, that's all, it's all speculative. I don't think anybody really knows that right now. Is it possible you could have fans in the stands for the stretch drive in the postseason? I think everybody would love that. I mean, not just from a revenue standpoint, just from an atmosphere standpoint. I mean, playing hockey in an empty building, no matter how they try to present it on TV, it's just not the same thing. You need that atmosphere. You need that, crowd energy, and you can't. There's no substitute for that. There's no substitute for the Stanley Cup playoffs in front of a packed building of screaming fans. So, I mean, that's what everybody wants. Is it possible this year? It is, but I would think it'd be more towards the postseason side if they're able to do that.
Yeah. And it takes you back to where we started today. I mean, the fans were a big part of that game in '76, and so many of the Flyers' playoff victories. And there's nothing like it. And hopefully we can get back there. And we just don't know, like you said.
Yeah, hopefully we'll have a little more clarity over the next week or so as to what the scheduling plans are. Again, there's a whole lot of things they need to sort out, both in terms of policies and procedures and the financial side too. So they need to get moving on it. I mean, both sides know that. So we'll have I think a little better sense, hopefully by this time next week, as to when we might be looking at training camps in the start of the season. And I know I can speak for probably you guys too. I'm chomping at the bit to get going.
Absolutely. Well, Bill, I just don't know what to say. Thank you so much for doing this tonight. It was a blast, and everything Dan said about what you've done and the kind of work you do and your objectivity, I co-sign with that, because that's one of the things that really keeps people coming back. They're getting firsthand info, but they're getting the kind of objectivity that you've always brought with Hockey Buzz and all your ventures and your endeavors.
Well, I appreciate that, guys. Thank you. And I had a good time.
Yeah. So what can you tell the folks about, some of the things you're doing, the podcast you're involved with, and some of the places people can catch up with your work and you on social media?
Right now on the Flyers official website and on Flyers Broadcast Network, we're commingling a series on Flyers goalies through the years. And for this one, everybody talks about Bernie, everybody talks about Hexy, talks about Pelly's one magical season before the car crash. Really what Jason Martinez and I wanted to do was we wanted to work some other goalies into it as well. So I wrote an article today that will run, I think a little later this week on the Flyers website on the 5 most underrated seasons by Flyers goalies. So these toss out the years that Flyers goalies won the Vezina, and that was fun. It was fun to pick 5 of those seasons and to talk about. As I said earlier, one of them was Wayne Stevenson's 75-76 season. Was one of the one that was on there. Before that, we did a series on the Flyers Hall of Fame, where we interviewed some guys who are in the Flyers Hall, and I did a series on guys who are candidates for the Flyers Hall. Simone Gagne, I did one on, Mark Recchi, Rick Tocchet, Danny Briere, and I wanted to get one in the series on a guy who's not necessarily a slam dunk, but it would be a popular choice among many. I put Scott Hartnell as the last one in that series. Once the goalie week series, which will have one on the evolution of Flyers goalie masks over the years, just a lot of cool little things. I did one on the how the relationship between Jacques Plante and Bernie Parent then later influenced the relationship between Bernie and Pelly. So that was one that was done, came from a lot of research that I had done over the years, and that one was a blast to put together. And I think that one may run this week, may run tomorrow. So when we finish that series, the Flyers Goaltender Week series, we'll get into hopefully training camp coverage, or at least talking about some previews for the season, rookies who might make the team, what are the roster battles, what are the questions going in, that kind of thing. And that's hopefully the plan as we get into the latter part of December and into January. And you can also find me every day on hockeybuzz.com. And also I am the content manager for the Philadelphia Flyers Alumni Association. We have a new website, which is flyersalumni.net. We used to be flyersalumni.org. But we've redesigned the website. It has a cooler, cleaner look to it. Still cleaning up a little bit here and there, but if people want to get a sense of how it'll look, they can go there and check that out. So, staying busy, but really looking forward to actually having some games and current team stuff to talk about again real soon.
Yeah, absolutely.
The
Bill?
goalie one's good. Yeah, the goalie series is good. I listened to the one with Marty Biron, and that was excellent. I was looking forward to getting some time off tomorrow to maybe binge a couple more. But they were very good so far.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Yeah,
absolutely.
Jason and I just did one with Bobby Taylor, and there are two that are now live with Michael Layton and with Robert Esch. And I think
that's right.
One or two more after the Bobby Taylor one too.
Well, that'll make Dan the Flyer fan happy about Robert Esch.
Yep.
Yeah, he's a big fan. But one of the, before I let you go, I just got to ask you, is one of those underrated seasons Pete Peters?
Pete Peters, 79-80. Yep.
Yeah.
Nice.
Listen, I mean, the 35-game unbeaten streak. Now he shared the net with Phil Muir, but really Peters was the
primary guy.
Peters was better with the two goalies, and made. Yeah, I mean, Peters, when you're talking about the really good Flyers goalies, and not to get too much on a tangent here, but I mean, Peters started his career with back-to-back All-Star seasons, had a rough third year, gets traded to Boston, but won a Vezina with the Bruins. So, when you talk about really good Flyers goalies, Peters never seems to come up, but he was a good one.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Bill, thanks so much. We'll have to do this again when we get back to normal. We actually have action to talk about.
Yeah, that'd be fun, guys. Thanks.
Absolutely. Thanks so much.
Hey, guys, appreciate it.
All right, you take care.
You too, man. Take care.
Right. Bye-bye. Yeah, well, we had a little bit of a technical glitch there, and but no problem. We're going to wrap it up for you tonight. Chef, where can people find you on social?
You can find me at Chef to Left B on Twitter.
Great. You can follow Dan Silver at dsilver88 on Twitter, dsilver88. And, of course, you can follow me, Isaiah, ISAIAH _520, Isaiah _520. You can follow the O&B Puckcast at O&B Puck, at O&B Puck. Please rate and subscribe, particularly on Apple. If you could give us a subscription on YouTube, give us a thumbs up. It really helps us move us up the charts for your various podcast platforms, of which there are a multitude. SoundCloud, TuneIn, Stitcher, I think you get the deal. And we're going to close out tonight. Just a reminder, FlyersNittyGritty.com, they have a new sponsor. Jim's of South Street, Steaks and Hoagies. They're at 400 South Street in Philly. What is it, Chef? It's like 4 decades? It's crazy.
It's been a long time. It's been there forever.
Long time. They are definitely on your cheese steak bucket list. You got to go there at 400 South Street. And if you're nearby and you can't make it, I think they also are connected with DoorDash. So Jim's of South Street, one of the best steaks, always in that top list, best sandwiches out there. And I know Jamie Basco from FlyersNittyGritty.com is really happy to have them aboard. And with that, as we closed earlier, hopefully next show we're going to have some particulars for you about what the league and the PA have come across with. and we'll have training camp dates and a lot of information. And you never know, we might have a flurry of transactions, Chef. I mean, finally somebody's going to sign Mike Hoffman, and that could facilitate a trade. And finally somebody gets traded from Tampa Bay to free up some cap space for them.
Yep, all you need is a start date at this point. I think the rest will fall like dominoes.
That's it. So with that, folks, until next time, take care.